So, what would you say if someone earnestly wanted to know what is evidence that Jesus was even real? What would you say?
Well, the first thing I would say is I'm an academic. Yes, I'm an apologist, so I'm not supposed to overstate things. But the idea that Jesus didn't exist is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I mean, even Bart Ehrman, one of the leading atheists of our day, wrote a whole book about the idea that Jesus didn't exist. I think he said this idea doesn't emerge until like the 17th century, and he calls it a myth. And the reason is we just have too many sources, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, independent books, historical accounts. We have Acts, we have the writings of Paul, we have the writings of Peter, we have the rest of the New Testament. We have early church fathers who assume that Jesus existed, those who received the baton, so to speak, from the gospel writers themselves. And then we have Josephus in the 90s, like, 3 decades after the deaths of Peter and Paul, talking about the existence and death of Jesus, by the way. We have a Roman writer, early second century, and even the critics of Christianity, when you get into the second century and the third, like Celsus and others, they never challenge the existence of Jesus. They say he was illegitimate, there's contradictions in the Bible. They raise other objections. So the idea that Jesus didn't exist is just silly and it's ridiculous.
What about those that say, okay, yeah, Jesus existed, but there were a lot of revolutionaries in that time who challenged the authority of Rome or maybe even said that they were the Messiah. And Jesus, he just happened to gain traction. It's kind of all a coincidence and he died and that was the end of it. And he's really not special because other people were just like him. What do we say to that?
What I would say is, wow, that's an interesting hypothesis. What evidence do you have that that hypothesis is actually true? I mean, when people say things like that, they're going to have to defend it. And then I'm going to say, all right, let's imagine you're right. Why do we have so many people who believe that Jesus was the Son of God, believe that he did miracles, and believe that he rose on the third day? I mean, the vast majority of scholars, this comes from Gary Habermas's research. He's published recently in his book, On the Resurrection, Volume 1. He says the vast majority of scholars, like 90% plus, believe that the disciples at least report that they had experiences of the risen Jesus that they believed were real. Like they're reporting what they think are real experiences. So if Jesus didn't say and do these things, how do we account for the disciples' beliefs? But then how do we get James, the brother of Jesus? And according to Mark 3 and John 7, the brothers of Jesus were not believers in him during his lifetime. And then James is martyred in AD 62, the head of the church in Jerusalem. How do you get Paul to believe this? And the vast majority of scholars believe that Paul had an experience that he believed was of the risen Jesus. So if we only had one account, then maybe we could explain this away. But we have so many different accounts that line up on the big details. And you have the disciples and the apostles and James willing to suffer and die for the belief that they'd seen the risen Jesus. It's not enough to just say, well, maybe he was like some other Messiah and passed away, and the largest religion in the world just took off from that. You're going to need a better explanation.
Hmm. And what about the crucifixion? I mean, obviously people
Hmm.
know if they agree that Jesus lived, they know that he died, but the entire crucifixion thing, him dying on a cross, the mob choosing him to be crucified over Barabbas, Pontius Pilate, the two criminals on either side of him, is that not just all kind of a myth that Christians have put together to, kind of finish their narrative that he was this sacrificial lamb?
So the claim that Jesus wasn't crucified is about up there as being as really contra what we know historically speaking, and I would argue ridiculous, with the claim that Jesus didn't exist. The evidence for the crucifixion of Jesus is virtually overwhelming. Now, why? Well, for one, again, we have multiple early sources. We have 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which arguably that creed embedded within Corinthians could be dated within 3 to 5 years of the death of Jesus. We have the other New Testament books. We have the Gospels. We have Acts. Again, we have the early church fathers who the apostles, some of them knew, and they're writing at the end of the first century into the second century, affirming the crucifixion of Jesus. Again, we also have Josephus, a Jew, and Tacitus, a Roman, early 2nd century, Josephus in the 90s, who not only affirmed that Jesus lived, but affirmed that he was crucified. Now, the other piece that I would add to this is it's also not the kind of thing that early Christians would invent if they're trying to build a movement. So crucifixion was the most shameful, dishonorable, humiliating, painful death imaginable. Deuteronomy says if you're hung on a tree, you're cursed. You were shamed publicly, brought shame on your faith, brought shame on your country. It was the ultimate worst death imaginable. So if the apostles are inventing a faith and they're trying to get people to follow it, a crucifixion is the least likely death that they would give. Rather than dishonorable, they would invent an honorable death, at least far more likely. So you add that theological point to the historical point. I think the only people that really deny the crucifixion of Jesus would be mythicists, which are a handful. You can count them on one, maybe two hands, who deny that Jesus existed, and Muslims, which in Surah 4, and of course the Quran's not written until roughly 7 centuries or so after the time of Jesus, Surah 4 denies the crucifixion. And I would argue, unless somebody's already committed to that being the word of God or historical, and I don't think there's good independent reason to take it as being so, you would never reject the crucifixion of Jesus. It's just too firmly established.